Hiya, in this lesson we're going to look at an entire song from the perspective of soloing, and I've picked a track which has done the rounds a little bit on the internet. I think it was originally produced perhaps by Jam Track Central, can't remember exactly who it was, and most famously I think Guthrie Govan has recorded a solo which is much copied on YouTube and on the internet in general. A couple other guys who are sort of in that sort of fusiony sort of vein. So I thought, let's look at this tune and try and explore some of the approaches that other players take on it. And it's called the Larry Carlton Jam Track. It's not particularly Larry Carlton-like, although perhaps some of his earlier albums had one or two tracks that were like this. But basically speaking, it's a 16 bar progression which is very, very similar to a minor blues. And we've looked at some very similar progressions like this in the past, I think. But this particular one is quite interesting because it has an expanded turnaround section. And if you look to the right hand side of the screen here on the lead sheet, the bit that I'm referring to really is starting from here, going right through to the end of the sequence. So the A flat major chord to G minor 7th, and then the same again, then with a kind of 2-5 to take you back to C minor, would be for a lot of people the turnaround anyway if it was a 12 bar blues, but it's been extended by a further 4 bars to give you the 16 bar cycle. And I've left this bar here blank because it actually has some chord stabs that are sort of on the recording. So you're pretty free to play whatever you want there, but as we'll see in a minute or two, there's a number of choices you can take in that. So the first thing to have a look at with a progression like this is the key, the most significant chord changes that come up, and how to deal with them. And we're pretty much in a tonic key of C minor here. And I use that term advisedly because a tonic minor is slightly different from things like a Dorian minor. And in fact, I've heard a few guys play over this particular track on the internet where they went straight for Dorian on this, and that's going to work okay, but in fact this chord should really have a flattened 6th in it. So modally this is an Aeolian tonic minor chord. It's a bit of a mouthful, that. But basically speaking, what it's saying is that you're in the key of E flat major and you're playing the relative minor of that key. So we're kind of thinking E flat major, but actually the tonic chord is the relative minor of E flat major, so it's C minor. And if you played E flat major scale from C, you would get a scale like this, which gives you root, 2nd, flat 3rd, 4th, 5th, flattened 6th, really important, flat 7th, then root. Now I've included with the lesson some scale fingerings for the E flat major scale, which I'm guessing you probably know pretty well, but they're there just as a reference for you if you want to look at them or brush up on them or anything like that. And for the most part, in terms of a tonic key, that's where we're going to remain, but there are some subtle changes in the chord progression which we need to be aware of, and the first one comes up very quickly where it goes to F minor 7th. Now C minor 7th and F minor 7th are both in the key of E flat major, so we have chord 6 in E flat major, then chord 2 in E flat major. So the good news there is that we don't really have to change scale, we can keep playing the E flat major scale on both of those. And then the same thing happens again a little bit later. When you get to the 5th and 6th bar, you're on to F minor 7th again. So again, if you're playing the E flat major scale, which of course is the same notes as C Aeolian, then you're on the right tracks there. But when we get down to here, we've got to be a little bit more careful. We've got this chord change here, A flat major 7th to G minor 7th, A flat major again, then a 2-5 to take us back to C minor. And in fact, this section I referred to earlier as a turnaround is actually the point in the progression where we've got a lot more room to play things. Most of the guys I've heard playing on this, Guthrie Govan included, and the other guy, Marcos Folkley, I think, I don't know if that's the way you pronounce his name, I've heard him playing it, they definitely resort to more arpeggio based ideas over this because that's really the most sensible choice on these chords. E flat major as a key has G minor 7th in it, so we're not really too concerned about that, but I still think the arpeggio would be a good choice there. And A flat major 7th, of course, is chord 4 in E flat major. So it is possible, and there are definitely guys out on YouTube who've done it, just to keep playing the E flat major scale all the way through it. But I think for a little bit of variety, playing arpeggios over these, which I'll show you in a minute, it's actually quite a good idea. Now, when we get to this point, the D minor 7 flat 5 to G 7th altered, we were looking at altered scales and the half whole diminished scale before, and these would be good places to use, particularly the altered scale. Sometimes when you see a 2 and a 5 chord put together there, a lot of players, particularly if the tune is quite fast, and this one is, I think it's 124 beats per minute, so you may not have time really to think of a separate idea on this chord and then another idea on that chord when they're only being played for 2 beats each. So a trick a lot of players do is they ignore the chord 2 and they just focus on the chord 5, because the chances are pretty high by the time you start playing on this you're going to be on that chord anyway. So a lot of players do that, they ignore the chord 2 and play in the chord 5. So what we're getting from all that, just to summarise it quickly, is that we're pretty much in the key of E flat major, or in fact in real terms it's relative minor, C minor, and if we want to we can pretty much play the E flat major scale, which of course becomes C natural minor or C Aeolian throughout the whole thing. It will sound a bit one-dimensional doing that, but it will work. My suggestion though is to start to think a little bit about using arpeggios, particularly here. That may give you a little bit more interest in a solo. And on this section here I'm suggesting perhaps looking at the G altered scale on that. And the rest of it you can pretty much play as I've described. Now of course we can also delve back into our vocabulary of other scales, and you could use C minor pentatonic really successfully over this. It sounds great. All the guys I mentioned before used elements of that in their playing as well, but again, one scale being used all the time can get a little bit one-dimensional, so good idea to try and mix things up. The C blues scale also works really good over this, and you hear a lot of players use that on this kind of track. So let's start by thinking how we might approach soloing on this now that we've got a clear idea with scales and some arpeggios. First thing I'd look at with something like this is not to be dragged into the tempo. It's quite a fast tempo and very easy to play very busy very quickly, you know, playing a lot of notes right from the word go. So the first thing I'd probably think about here is to try and kind of relax myself into tune a little bit and just play fairly short phrases. I'll show you the kind of thing I mean. Okay, so what I was trying to do there more than anything else was to leave some space at the end of a phrase, and I'm sure when I listen back to it I'll probably think I could have left more space, but the important thing to think about when you start solo is that you're telling a story. I mentioned this before in a few videos, and if you try and give everybody the plot of the story in the first paragraph of the first chapter in the first part of the book, then there's nowhere for you to go. So you've got to try and think about how you're going to lay out your narrative in musical terms. So that's not a bad idea to start with, just short phrases. You could even get very specific with it and say that you'll play a bar, rest a bar, play another bar, rest another bar, or you might extend that to playing a couple of bars and then resting a couple of bars. And it was once described to me as in terms of a phrasing approach, like thinking of not playing on your first or second impulse to play, but on your third and your fourth. And that's a good way to describe it, because it means that you allow the listener some breathing space to take in what it is that you're playing and kind of get an idea of where you're going to go with your particular melodic approaches. So that's a good place to start with it. In terms of other techniques I use there, use quite a few slides, glissandos, because that tends to give things a bit more of a vocal expression. You know, so for example, some of the things I used were like playing the same phrase 2-3 times, because it not only sounds a bit more vocal, but it actually provides a bit of interest rather than just literally playing fretted notes all the time as you go through any one of your solo lines. The other thing I tried to do there was to keep it, I suppose, in a fairly bluesy sort of vein. So I used the blues scale a fair bit, and maybe some phrases that were kind of reminiscent of that sort of style. Again, my main thinking there was not to get drawn into sort of playing very busy right from the word go. So that was pretty much my thinking there. This time I'm going to play on it and use a little bit more of the E flat major scale on it, so it's going to be, because of that, a little bit busier. So when you listen back to that, you'll definitely hear I was using some patterns. I used a couple of major scale patterns which are based in thirds. I also used a little bit of repetition around 3-note phrases, things like really just taking the same rhythm and shifting the scale pitches, but all the scale pitches were from E flat major. So that can be a good kind of second gear to go into in the solo. To my mind, the thing to avoid at the beginning of a solo, unless you're literally playing a 4-8 bar solo and you've got to give it everything you've got very quickly, and the track calls for it, of course, is that if you play too busy, too fast, as I mentioned before, you run out of steam very quickly. So all these things can be very much uppermost in your mind when you're practicing, but what we're aiming for is that when you perform with other musicians or you're doing a gig or a recording, that you don't think this analytically about things, but because you practice this way, it starts to come out more naturally when you work with others, and you can think more freely when you're playing. Nobody's really thinking in a normal improvised solo to this degree, but in practice, of course, you can, because you're trying different ideas out. Now, the other thing I did a little bit of there was I started to pick up the point I made at the beginning of the video about using some arpeggios. Now, I didn't do anything particularly drastic with it, but I did play a little bit around an A flat major 7th arpeggio up there. So major 7th, root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, and then resolved that to D, which gives me the 5th of G minor, B flat, the minor 3rd of G minor, to the root. In fact, let me do a bit more of that just on that section with the arpeggios. Okay? Okay, here we go. So when you listen to that back, it's going to sound a little bit exercise based, but I deliberately played it that way so you could hear it. So what that does is that stands out from other ideas, particularly if the other ideas are very scale orientated. And sometimes it can be a great way of really building a solo, is to start to introduce more and more arpeggio phrases. And of course I'm playing them there with very simple rhythms, but you could double or triple those rhythms, you could syncopate them, you could put more rests in. In fact, all those things are good to try out in a solo, because it then kind of disguises the fact that all you're really doing is just playing an arpeggio. But the worst thing in the world is just to play. Immediately sounds like a worked out lick, so good idea to try and break things up rhythmically. In fact, what I'm going to do now is take another solo in the whole sequence, and still going to be using these same ideas: pentatonic blues scale, E flat major scale, some arpeggios at the A flat major 7th and G minor 7th chords. But I'm going to start to try and hopefully come up with more interesting rhythms rather than just play everything as straight 8th notes or 16th notes. So I'm going to probably play quite an exaggerated example where I'm deliberately trying to break up the rhythms so they don't sound so even. Okay, so I got a bit carried away at the end, but hopefully from that, and again if you maybe rewind it 2 or 3 times, you'll hear that I'm very deliberately trying not to stay with the same rhythm too long. I'm trying to develop it a little bit. I'm sure some of it, could be much better organised and joined up, but that's the whole point about practicing, is it gives you the opportunity to try various different ideas out. So every time I went back to something that sounded more predictable phrasing to me, tried to keep my musical mind on top of everything, certainly in charge of my fingers, by going, okay, don't play that, try this, or let's think of a rhythm, let's see if I can play that rhythm. And of course sometimes it's quite hard, because your musical subconscious says, I want to hear such and such a rhythm, and then your hands kind of go, I don't really want to play that because it's quite hard. But that's the whole point of practice, is that the more you let your musical subconscious get in charge of your fingers rather than the other way around, the more you can pull off more interesting ideas. Because quite literally, if you hear a rhythm and it sounds great, your fingers are going to have to try and play it. It might take you a few attempts to get it right, but that's the whole point, and that pushes your playing standard forward, which is very, very important to do. Okay, now let's look at some other ideas that we could use on this progression. I mentioned before about the last bar on this line where it has the 2 and the 5 chord kind of going back to C minor, and that there might be an opportunity here, particularly if you thought of the 5 chord for the whole bar, of using the altered scale. Now this is definitely going to jazz things up a little bit and sound perhaps less rocky and a little bit more jazz rocky or fusiony. I don't know what the right word is for that. So what I'm going to do here is play on it and really make a big point about using the altered scale here. Now, 2 things to be aware of here. The altered scale has a very tense sound, as we've already seen, and the main reason for that is it's introducing notes which are chromatic to the parent key, in this case C minor or E flat major. So you have to be careful when you use this kind of sound. If you overdo it, it sounds like the whole piece is overcooked. If you underplay it, the whole thing sounds like it's too diatonic and too safe. So we're trying to find a happy medium, a kind of sweet spot, where there's enough tension being introduced into your solo by the use of the altered scale, but at the same token it doesn't overwhelm everything surrounding it. So that's one thing to be aware of. The second thing is that depending on how extreme or otherwise you want that effect to be, the effect being using the altered scale, you may find certain notes in the scale actually sound pretty discordant against the underlying harmony, not so much on the G7th chord itself, but on the chords that surround it. And this actually brings me to quite an important point about this. There really is no such thing as a wrong note on a chord. There's only what would be perceived by the majority of people as being something that sounds consonant against the chord, you know, sounds clear and not in any way discordant, or you'd have a dissonance against the chord. And without a balance between consonance and dissonance, then the solos can easily sort of get lost and not sound very good. So it's always a battle to try and see how much you can get away with on the consonant side and the dissonance side. So basically it's kind of right notes and notes that maybe are not right but actually sound pretty good. That's not a great way of explaining it, but I think you get the idea. So what I'm going to do here is use the altered scale, particularly on that section, but I might continue it a little bit into the C minor 7th before I resolve. And again, if you listen back to the recording a bit, you'll hear where I do it. Okay. First thing you'll have heard there is there was 2 notes really stuck out as not sounding very good, and I put them in deliberately, and they were the B naturals, which of course is a note within the altered scale. Remember our altered scale, root, flat 9, sharp 9, major 3rd, that's the note. Now the reason why that sounded not that great against the chord that follows it, which is C minor, was C minor's got a flat 7th, I was playing the major 7th. Now where I played it is probably more important than actually what the note was. I played it on a strong beat, so therefore immediately, and you'll hear it when you listen back to that particular part of the track, when you put those notes sometimes on a strong beat against a chord which does not normally support that note, you're going to get that problem. And what I'm going to demonstrate now is you can disguise it. So in fact what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play the altered scale again at those points, but I'm going to surround it by using some of the embellishment techniques, which I often talk about in lessons. And this is basically an idea where you take notes, generally speaking, in a chord, but you can also do it with scale pitches, and you use chromatic notes to surround either the arpeggio tones or the scale tones. Some of the simplest ones are things like playing a semitone below your whatever your target note is, and then a scale step above, and it's got a very typical kind of jazz sound, but also works really well in a fusion setting, so you'll definitely hear where I use it. Right, the end there, went back to putting it on a strong beat. How awful does that sound? So you've got to be very careful how you do it. So if you rewind that a few times, you'll hear all in those kind of chromatically embellished lines, the same note, the B natural, is still in there, but if I did it like the last time I played it there, it's right on the beat and it sounds awful. If you put it on a weak beat in the bar, then it becomes much clearer. And I think if you rewind some of those examples several times, you'll hear it, but that's not a mistake, I'm doing it deliberately. So you can hear why you have to be very careful sometimes where you use the alto scale. Okay, a couple of final points on this progression is when you're playing tunes that are like this, the kind of medium to up tempo, it's very tempting, as I mentioned earlier, to get too busy too fast. So another approach you could take on this is to do something like take much longer note values than you might normally play, and a great way to do that comfortably, and I suppose in the style of the music, is to play some string bends. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play in it with much more emphasis on string bends, which is hopefully going to force me to sort of play less, and what I do play will hopefully be of longer note durations. It's sometimes a good contrast in a solo to do this. Okay, so you can see where Carlos Santana gets a lot of ideas from just picking certain notes against chords and playing them with a bend with a bit of vibrato on it. Really important skill to work on that, because it may not always be the case that the style of solo that you want to play is possible, particularly if, for example, you're recording somebody else's music. They might want something more like that, where you're playing longer notes and you're using string bends. And it's a useful skill, very important skill to get under the fingers. The other thing, of course, there is you have to be very careful about what notes you're bending to. Most of the time there I played it pretty safe and was bending to things like the third or the seventh of a chord. A couple of occasions I think I did the fifth. And that also makes it more melodic. So different points where you could try this kind of idea. You might want to do it at the beginning of a solo, just to sort of ease yourself into it. You might want to do it towards the end of a solo if you're, you know, coming down from being quite busy, would be quite high up in the neck, playing a lot of notes, and then you want to sort of come away from that before, say, another instrumentalist takes over, either with a melody or perhaps another solo. And it just gives you a nice kind of way to gently exit your solo without being very abrupt. So anyway, it's a great track to play on. I'd highly recommend listening to what now seems to be hundreds of different people playing on this on YouTube, and it was actually part of my reason for picking it, because it's always informative and educational to look at how other people play on pieces of music you're studying. And just on a quick search on the internet earlier, I saw there was probably about 10 or 15 people just in a couple of pages I examined who'd had a go at the track. Obviously there's the originals, you've got people like Guthrie Govan, Marco Sfogley, again I don't know how to pronounce his name. Those two guys seem to be you know, very high in the rankings there. But there's lots of other people who've sort of copied some of what they've done or done their own thing, so really important to check that out. But main thing here is have a listen through to what I've played, some of the suggestions, and give it a try yourself. You know, great actually if you want to record something and send it over, you know, it'd be nice to hear you playing on it. Anyway, have fun with that, and I'll see you next time.